Nero was once the most powerful man in the world, ruling over an empire that stretched across continents. But beneath the splendor and glory, his reign was driven by suspicion, cruelty, and extravagant indulgence. What began as a reign filled with potential soon turned into madness, as Nero's unpredictable decisions and tyrannical rule alienated those closest to him. Once celebrated by the people, Nero would soon become the most despised emperor in Roman history. His actions, fueled by ambition and ego, left the empire on the brink of collapse. From his brutal murder of his own mother to the chaotic aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome, Nero's reign was marked by scandal, betrayal, and eventual ruin. His rise to power and subsequent downfall reshaped the Roman Empire, leaving a legacy of fear and destruction. This is the story of Nero, the emperor who was consumed by his thirst for power, and whose tyrannical rule shattered the very empire he sought to control. Stay tuned as we unravel the shocking rise and catastrophic fall of Nero, one of the most notorious emperors in history. Nero's path to the throne was steeped in ambition, manipulation, and political maneuvering. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD to Agrippina the Younger, a woman known for her ruthless ambition, Nero was thrust into the volatile world of Roman politics. Agrippina, desperate for power, orchestrated Nero's adoption by her uncle, Emperor Claudius, positioning him as the heir to the throne. In 54 AD, Claudius mysteriously died, possibly poisoned by Agrippina, and Nero was declared emperor at the age of 16. His rise to power seemed to promise a new era for Rome. Early on, Nero's reign appeared favorable. He was seen as an energetic young ruler, willing to reform and bring about a golden age for the empire. His advisors, including his mother and the respected philosopher Seneca, helped guide him through these early years. However, despite initial promises, the power dynamics were far from stable. Agrippina's heavy influence over Nero was suffocating, and beneath the surface, the young emperor was growing restless. Tensions between mother and son soon escalated, setting the stage for the brutal and erratic rule that was about to unfold. Nero's rise was just the beginning of a reign that would spiral into chaos, leaving a legacy of cruelty, betrayal, and tragedy. Nero's early years as emperor were nothing like the tyrant we know from history. When Nero took the throne at just 16 years old, he was anything but the ruler we think of today. In fact, in the beginning, he was more of a puppet, his strings being pulled by his ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina wasn't just any mother. She was a political powerhouse. Having married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, Agrippina strategically maneuvered to have Nero adopted as his heir. It worked when Claudius mysteriously died in 54 AD, and rumors swirled that Agrippina may have poisoned him. Nero became emperor. But here's the catch: he wasn't ruling on his own. At first, it seemed like the start of a bright future for the empire. Nero, young and energetic, had potential. But instead of taking charge, he was guided every step of the way by Agrippina, who saw her son as a vehicle for her own ambitions. She was the true power behind the throne, making all the major decisions while Nero stayed in the background. Alongside Agrippina, Nero relied heavily on his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, who became a key advisor in those early years. Seneca, a man of wisdom, tried to guide the young emperor, teaching him the values of stoicism and good governance. But even Seneca, with his noble intentions, couldn't overshadow Agrippina's control. In those early days, Nero was completely dependent on these powerful figures to steer the empire. However, as time went on, Nero began to feel the weight of his mother's dominance. Imagine being in his shoes. On the one hand, you're emperor, but on the other, you're constantly under the thumb of your mother. Agrippina was making every decision, controlling the empire with a firm grip, and her influence was suffocating. Nero may have had the title, but he was far from free. As Nero matured, that restlessness grew into a burning desire for power. He wanted more autonomy, more control over his empire. But Agrippina wasn't willing to loosen her grasp. This created a clash of wills that was only going to end in one way. In 59 AD, Nero's frustration boiled over. He couldn't take it anymore. Agrippina's control was too much. And what did he do? The decision was made. Nero had to rid himself of the woman who had helped him seize the throne, his mother, Agrippina. But this wasn't an impulsive act, it was cold, calculated, and carefully planned. Nero began with a method that would have been a subtle move for someone less ambitious: poison. Agrippina, ever the savvy political figure, survived the poisoning attempt. But instead of backing down, Nero took it to a new level. This is where things got really bad. Nero devised an elaborate plan to kill his mother using a ship. A specially designed boat, rigged with a trap, was built to sink. Agrippina, thinking she was safe, boarded the ship. But when the ship started to sink, she managed to escape. She swam to shore, fighting for her life. Yet Nero wasn't done. He knew his mother couldn't survive the exposure and set his plan into motion once more. When Agrippina returned to her villa, her life was ended, this time not by a trap or a ship, but by the cold hands of a strangler. Nero gave the orders for her execution, and Agrippina was killed in her own home, betrayed by the son she had fought so hard to raise. This was the shocking, pivotal moment in Nero's reign, a moment that would change everything. His own mother, who had engineered his rise to power, was now out of the picture. It wasn't just a political move. It was deeply personal. Nero's matricide wasn't just about gaining power, it was about freedom. For the first time, Nero believed he could rule without anyone holding the reins. But that power came at a high cost. No longer under Agrippina's watchful eye, Nero was left to rule on his own terms, and it didn't take long for the empire to feel the repercussions. What followed was a dramatic shift in Nero's behavior. No longer the young emperor trying to please his mother, he now acted out his every whim, his every desire, with an unsettling sense of control. His early reign had promised reform, prosperity, and a golden age, but after Agrippina's murder, Nero's actions began to reflect a much darker side of his personality, one driven by paranoia, cruelty, and an obsession with maintaining absolute control. This shift wasn't just political, it was personal. The Nero who had once shown promise as a ruler now began to exhibit tyrannical traits. His rise to power had been facilitated by Agrippina's cunning, but it was his own choices that shaped his legacy from that moment on. As he grew more independent, he grew more erratic, engaging in lavish excesses, eliminating anyone he saw as a threat, and surrounding himself with sycophants who flattered his ego. By murdering Agrippina, Nero set the stage for a reign marked by cruelty, betrayal, and a desperate desire to prove himself to the world. It was the beginning of his downward spiral, one that would eventually lead to his destruction. The once hopeful emperor had turned into one of the most infamous rulers in Roman history. In 64 AD, one of the most catastrophic events in Roman history struck, the Great Fire of Rome. For 6 days, the fire raged through the city, consuming everything in its path. Thousands of homes, temples, businesses, and landmarks were turned to ash, leaving Rome in a state of ruin. The fire would not only reshape the physical landscape of the empire's capital but also forever link Nero's name to one of the most destructive disasters in history. The scale of the destruction was unimaginable. Imagine an entire city burning to the ground, its heart reduced to smoldering ruins. The fire spread so quickly that by the time it was finally extinguished, nearly 2/3 of Rome had been reduced to rubble. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out. Iconic buildings were lost. For the citizens of Rome, it was not just a disaster, it was a tragedy that would be remembered for generations. But amid all the devastation, the question on everyone's mind was, what role did Nero play in this disaster? Rumors spread quickly, and suspicion mounted. Was Nero the one who started the fire? Some accounts suggested that Nero had intentionally set the fire to clear space for his grand new palace, the Domus Aurea, a sprawling palace complex that would come to symbolize his excess. The idea that Nero would start such a catastrophic event just to make room for his own luxury was a theory that fit all too well with his reputation for indulgence. Though no concrete evidence ever surfaced to confirm these rumors, the very fact that they existed speaks volumes about the atmosphere surrounding Nero's reign. But perhaps more telling than the rumors was Nero's response, or rather, his lack of response. While Rome burned, Nero was far from the scene. In some accounts, he is described as distant and unconcerned. The flames that engulfed the city didn't seem to move him. Worse still, some say that while the city was in flames, Nero sat in his palace and played his lyre, singing about the fall of Troy, a scene that has been etched into history as the ultimate image of callousness and self-indulgence. It was this behavior that would solidify Nero's reputation as a ruler who was detached from the suffering of his people, more interested in his own performance than the well-being of the empire. As the city smoldered, Nero knew he had to act quickly to deflect the blame that was already starting to fall on him. And so, he did what any paranoid, power-hungry emperor would do: he shifted the blame. Nero's target? The growing Christian community in Rome, already viewed with suspicion by the Roman elite. Nero accused the Christians of starting the fire, claiming that they were the cause of the destruction. Whether he truly believed this or not doesn't matter. What mattered was that it gave him a scapegoat, and he was quick to exploit it. These executions weren't just about punishing the so-called enemies of the state, they were public spectacles, designed to entertain the Roman people while reinforcing Nero's image as a powerful and vengeful ruler. These gruesome displays of violence became a tool for Nero to demonstrate his authority and maintain control over the empire. By making examples out of the Christians, he sought to instill fear in the hearts of anyone who might dare challenge him. But Nero's persecution of Christians was more than just a political move. It was deeply personal. His growing paranoia and need for absolute control fueled his actions. The Christian community was seen as a threat, not only because of its rapid growth but also because its followers were increasingly disinterested in Roman traditions and religious practices. To Nero, this was an affront to his authority. His desperation to maintain his grip on power led him to take drastic measures against a group that had become an easy target. The flames of the Great Fire were still fresh, but Nero's actions toward the Christians would leave a much more lasting mark on his reign. His cruelty toward this vulnerable minority only intensified his notoriety, but it also had an unexpected consequence: it galvanized the Christian community. Instead of eradicating Christianity, Nero's brutal actions helped spread the faith further. Christians, united by their suffering, grew stronger and more resilient in the face of persecution. The very people Nero sought to destroy became more determined than ever to spread their beliefs. The persecution of Christians also marked a turning point in the Roman Empire's relationship with the nascent Christian faith. What began as a small, fringe movement became a symbol of defiance in the face of brutal oppression. Nero's efforts to eradicate Christianity only made it more visible and, ironically, more attractive to those disillusioned with the empire's excesses. This accusation set the stage for one of the most brutal crackdowns on a minority group in Roman history. Nero launched a vicious persecution of Christians. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Some were burned alive, others were crucified, and still others were torn apart by wild animals in the Colosseum for the entertainment of the masses. These public executions became a spectacle, a cruel form of entertainment for the Roman people while Nero tried to rebuild his image as the true ruler of Rome. What started as a response to the fire quickly turned into one of the earliest and most violent crackdowns on Christianity, a faith that was growing increasingly popular among the people of the empire. Nero's brutal persecution of Christians would have far-reaching consequences, but at the time, it was his way of keeping control and redirecting the anger and frustration of the Roman people. The fire, devastating as it was, became the perfect backdrop for Nero's actions, a symbol of his desperation to maintain power and avoid the blame for the catastrophe. The fire and its aftermath would become a turning point in Nero's reign. The growing discontent with his leadership, coupled with the brutal treatment of Christians, would set the stage for his eventual downfall. The Great Fire of Rome, while devastating, was more than just a natural disaster. It was a moment that highlighted Nero's flaws as a ruler. His failure to act when his people needed him, his indifference to their suffering, and his willingness to exploit tragedy for personal gain would leave a stain on his legacy that could never be erased. As Nero's reign progressed, his descent into decadence and cruelty accelerated. Initially, his reign had shown promise, but soon his thirst for power, indulgence in luxury, and obsession with his public image overshadowed his duties as emperor. Nero surrounded himself with extravagance, lavish feasts, endless entertainment, and the construction of his golden house, a sprawling palace that embodied his immense success. The Domus Aurea, with its rotating dining room and vast gardens, became a symbol of Nero's disregard for the empire's well-being, as the cost of such opulence drained the Roman treasury. Nero's passion for the arts also took on an obsessive quality. He began to perform in public, acting, singing, and playing the lyre, an emperor whose need for fame and admiration overtook his imperial responsibilities. His actions alienated the Roman elite, particularly the Senate, which viewed such behavior as undignified and unbecoming of an emperor. His participation in theatrical performances and his insistence on being treated as a performer above all else earned him scorn from those who had once supported him. Nero's growing paranoia and obsession with control led him to betray those closest to him. He began to purge his court, executing trusted advisors, including the philosopher Seneca, who had once guided him in his youth. Nero's cruelty extended even to his closest allies. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was swiftly eliminated, deepening the sense of fear and mistrust at court. The emperor, once a figure of promise, had now become a tyrant, surrounded by sycophants and enemies. Nero's excesses and brutal purges weakened his support base, and soon, whispers of rebellion began to grow. Nero's early court was filled with figures like Seneca, his trusted tutor, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, who helped him stabilize his early reign. These men were instrumental in keeping Nero on the throne as a young emperor, and for a time, they appeared to be loyal pillars of his administration. However, as Nero grew older and more paranoid, he began to see potential threats everywhere, even from those who had helped him rise to power. The turning point came when Nero, feeling increasingly insecure and desperate to maintain his grip on the throne, began to purge his court. The philosopher Seneca, once a trusted advisor and mentor, was forced to commit suicide after being accused of involvement in a conspiracy against Nero. Despite his long service and his attempts to guide Nero toward a more stable reign, Seneca became a victim of the emperor's growing mistrust. Nero's paranoia led him to believe that anyone close to him could be plotting against him, and no one was safe. But it wasn't just Seneca who met a tragic end. Nero also turned against his own wife, Octavia. Despite their political marriage, Nero grew increasingly dissatisfied with her, and when he became infatuated with another woman, Poppaea Sabina, he had Octavia banished and eventually executed. Nero's cruelty toward his own family further exemplified the instability of his reign. No one in his inner circle was immune from his wrath. Nero's reign, once filled with hope, was now marked by treachery, indulgence, and the collapse of political and moral order within his court. The emperor's disregard for the empire's stability and his obsession with self-gratification set the stage for the revolt that would ultimately bring his downfall. By the late 60s AD, Nero's empire was crumbling, his reign on the brink of total collapse. What had once been a symbol of absolute power now faced revolt, betrayal, and chaos. Nero's reckless spending, cruelty, and utter disregard for the well-being of Rome had alienated nearly every group within the empire. The Roman army, once fiercely loyal to their emperor, began to turn against him. Nero's inability to manage the mounting unrest became more and more evident. Revolts erupted in several provinces, and even the Roman elite, the very people who had once worshipped him, began questioning his ability to rule. As tensions grew, it became obvious, Nero was no longer the ruler who had once commanded unwavering loyalty. His empire was on the brink. Nero's reign, which once seemed unshakable, rapidly descended into chaos. By the late 60s AD, his grip on power was slipping fast, and the empire he ruled was on the brink of collapse. His reign, plagued by excess and mismanagement, led to widespread revolts across the empire. The discontent was impossible to ignore, and Nero's inability to govern effectively became painfully obvious. The first major revolt came in Gaul, where the governor Vindex declared himself emperor. His challenge was just the beginning. Although Vindex was defeated, his rebellion sparked a series of uprisings that spread through the empire. The most significant of these came from Galba, the governor of Spain, who also declared himself emperor. The Senate, which had already lost faith in Nero, sided with Galba, sealing Nero's fate. Nero's support evaporated. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, now abandoned him. His political base crumbled, and even his military, which had once been his strongest asset, turned against him. The emperor who had once stood at the pinnacle of power was now a fugitive, forced to flee Rome. Nero's desperation was intense. He was no longer the feared ruler of Rome, he was a man on the run, hunted by those who had once served him. The very empire he built now rejected him. With nowhere left to turn, Nero's fall was as dramatic as it was inevitable. Forced to flee, Nero, once the uncontested ruler of the Roman Empire, became a fugitive in the empire he had built. His options dwindled fast, and as he wandered, fear and paranoia consumed him. The reality of his downfall set in. The man who had once sat at the pinnacle of power was now running for his life. Nero's final days were a far cry from the lavish, grandiose lifestyle he had once enjoyed. Isolated and consumed by dread, he faced the unthinkable. The empire he ruled had rejected him, and his fate was sealed. As rebellion spread and his supporters vanished, Nero took his own life in 68 AD, an act of desperate finality. This moment was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of the Year of the Four Emperors, a period of brutal chaos and instability. Nero's death wasn't just the end of one emperor, it marked the unraveling of the empire itself. His story serves as a disturbing reminder: absolute power, when abused, doesn't last. Nero's reign, full of luxury and excess, fell apart under the weight of his paranoia, cruelty, and unchecked ambition. His death left Rome in disarray, but it also highlighted the fragility of empires built on fear and tyranny. Nero's death in 68 AD left behind a lasting, controversial legacy that would echo through Roman history. While some viewed him as a tyrant whose excesses and cruelty led to the downfall of the empire, others saw his reign in a more nuanced light. Nero's reign was marked by both destruction and achievement. Under his rule, the Roman Empire faced significant challenges, but it also saw remarkable achievements in architecture, culture, and entertainment. Nero's Domus Aurea, Golden House, is one of the most extravagant and infamous architectural projects in Roman history. Built after the Great Fire of 64 AD, this massive palace wasn't just a home, it was Nero's attempt to reassert his dominance over Rome, showcasing his excess and power. Spanning over 200 acres, the Golden House had everything: lush gardens, artificial lakes, and even a colossal statue of Nero himself towering over the city. But, as we'll see, Nero's obsession with luxury wasn't just a symbol of his grandeur, it was a symbol of his downfall. This palace, designed to reflect Nero's divine status, came at an enormous cost to the empire. The Roman treasury was drained to fund the construction, and with it came rising taxes that crushed the very people Nero claimed to protect. Nero's desire for opulence alienated the public, many of whom had already suffered from the aftermath of the Great Fire. As he indulged in unimaginable luxury, the people of Rome struggled to make ends meet, and Nero's image shifted from emperor to tyrant in the eyes of the common folk. The Domus Aurea became a monument not just to Nero's ego but to the excesses that ultimately led to his fall from grace. While the building itself was a marvel of Roman engineering, it symbolized everything wrong with Nero's rule. What was meant to immortalize his greatness only served to highlight his disconnect from the suffering of his people. The Golden House was a constant reminder of Nero's lack of empathy and disregard for the state's resources, and the cost was paid by the citizens who had once supported him. However, it is Nero's cruelty, particularly his persecution of Christians and the murder of his mother, that most defines his legacy. His reign is often remembered as one of brutality and excess, where personal ambition and paranoia led to widespread fear, betrayal, and suffering. Nero's treatment of Christians, especially after the Great Fire of Rome, set the stage for centuries of religious persecution, further cementing his place as one of the most despised emperors in history. Nero's legacy is one of contradictions: an emperor who both built and destroyed, who entertained and terrorized, who sought immortality through his artistic pursuits but was ultimately consumed by his own madness. His name became synonymous with tyranny, and over time, he was immortalized as the epitome of Roman decadence and cruelty. Yet, even in death, Nero's legacy left an indelible mark on Rome, setting a precedent for the fall of emperors who outlived their usefulness. Nero is often remembered as one of the most tyrannical and self-indulgent emperors in Roman history, but there was another side to him that many overlook: his deep obsession with the arts. Behind his cruel reign and lavish lifestyle, Nero saw himself not just as emperor, but as a performer, someone destined to entertain, to shine in the spotlight. His passion for the arts, particularly theater and music, became one of the defining aspects of his rule, and it was as controversial as it was bizarre. Nero didn't just admire the arts from a distance, he actively participated in them. He performed in public, singing, acting, and playing the lyre. The idea of an emperor engaging in public performances, something typically reserved for slaves and actors, was unheard of in Roman society and shocked the elite. Nero's insistence on being the center of attention wasn't just an eccentricity, it was a full-blown obsession. He performed in front of large audiences, even participating in dramatic competitions, an act that deeply offended Roman sensibilities. The elite of Rome, who expected their emperor to be a dignified leader, were horrified by Nero's behavior. For them, it was an unthinkable violation of imperial dignity. How could an emperor lower himself to the level of a performer, participating in the same entertainment his subjects enjoyed? Yet, for Nero, the desire for fame and validation drove him to seek applause and admiration, not from the Senate or the military, but from the people. He longed to be remembered not only as an emperor but as an artist, a figure of eternal fame. Nero's obsession with public performance became so consuming that it overshadowed his duties as emperor. While the empire faced growing unrest and his policies drained the state's resources, Nero was more focused on his next performance, obsessed with winning theatrical contests and outshining other artists. His public performances became bizarre spectacles that reflected his growing need for attention and control. It wasn't just about artistry for him, it was about power and dominance over every part of Roman society, even the entertainment world. But the impact of Nero's artistic pursuits wasn't just limited to his ego. His involvement in the arts had real consequences for Rome. As Nero spent more time on his performances, the empire's problems, political unrest, military rebellion, and economic decay, went unchecked. His obsession with being an artist distracted him from governing, and his tyrannical behavior toward his court, military, and people grew. Nero's constant self-promotion in the arts only further alienated those who had once supported him. Nero's reign continues to fascinate and horrify historians, filmmakers, and storytellers to this day. The emperor who ruled with such extravagance and cruelty has remained one of history's most iconic villains. Yet, despite his notorious actions, Nero's legacy isn't entirely one of pure evil. Beneath his tyrannical rule, there were flashes of reform, artistic pursuits, and a desire to leave a lasting impact on Rome. His lavish architectural projects, such as the Domus Aurea, and his love for music and theater contributed to the cultural landscape of the empire. However, these achievements are often overshadowed by his cruelty and paranoia. The murders, the persecutions, and the widespread destruction he caused in his pursuit of power are what define his rule. Nero's desire for fame and his obsession with public approval eventually led to his downfall, highlighting the dangers of absolute power unchecked by conscience or responsibility. His reign serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of empires and the perils of unchecked ambition. Despite all this, Nero remains a fascinating character, an emperor whose life and reign offer endless lessons in the dangers of tyranny and excess. We continue to love to hate him, but perhaps there is something to learn from his tragic rise and fall. Ultimately, Nero's story is one of how absolute power, when abused, can lead to the destruction of both the ruler and the empire he sought to control. His reign, as destructive as it was, remains a crucial chapter in understanding the complexities of imperial rule and the fragility of even the most powerful empires. What do you think? Was Nero really an evil emperor, or was it just a tragic downfall driven by the immense pressures of power? Let's have your take on this in the comment section. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating rulers.